Hi everybody, Captain Steve here, aboard Cloud 9 on this cool winter morning. And I thought it might be appropriate to talk about some of the weather influencers that we have, specifically here in San Francisco Bay, but it could be applied to almost any coastal region that has microclimates. Microclimates are those small little areas within the larger navigational zone that have their own special little weather systems. Well, San Francisco Bay is definitely one of those places. So we'll talk a little bit about how San Francisco Bay plays into the bigger picture for the boater. I'd like to break it up and talk about some of the predominant weather influencers of San Francisco Bay, both in seasonality or summer and fall versus winter and spring, as well as talk about some of the other things that influence our boating on the water, such as currents, the horizontal movement of the water as it relates to the rising and falling of the tides, and how that interplays with the predominant wind patterns that we have here in the bay and in other coastal areas in those different seasons: summer, fall, winter, and spring. So let's talk about some of those weather influencers that we have. Okay, so as we talked about, we have different weather systems that affect our San Francisco Bay area and the nearby coastal areas differently during different times of the year. So I'll start by talking about our typical summer and fall wind patterns on San Francisco Bay and what causes them. So if we think about unequal heating of the land, which is represented on this chart, and the water and the ocean out here, which are the whiter areas of the deeper areas, we think about the unequal heating of those two surfaces every day. The sun comes up, it heats the land much quicker than the water. The water absorbs the sun's energy, whereas the land radiates it back into the atmosphere in the form of heat. And as we all know, heat rises. So as the land heats up in the early morning hours of the day, again, usually in the summer and fall, the hot air rises. Well, this causes what you might consider to be a vacuum over the land areas, especially the land areas in the central California Valley that heat up very quickly. This vacuum literally causes a low pressure area over the land that must be filled with inrushing air. So that is what drives this whole thermal weather system, what we call the thermal sea breeze in San Francisco Bay. As the hot air rises off the land, low pressure forms here, therefore a higher pressure area over the waters just adjacent to San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate entrance exists out here. And because that warm air rising causes a void here, you might say, the cooler air off the Pacific Ocean starts to move inland to fill that void. Well, if you look here on our chart of San Francisco Bay and the surrounding area, you can see that there is a natural gap here called the Golden Gate. There are very few natural gaps within many, many miles of the Golden Gate. Therefore, that cooler air flows just like it flows towards a funnel and through a funnel. It flows through the Golden Gate and spreads out into central San Francisco Bay, causing our typical summer and fall sea breezes that blow through the gate. Sometimes in the middle of the summer, July, August especially, we have winds in excess of 25 to 30 knots on a typical afternoon after that thermal sea breeze pattern sets up. So as a general rule of thumb for the San Francisco Bay boater, it's interesting to note that if you know the air temperature in Sacramento, which is in the Central Valley, in that area that warms up quickly. And you know the air temperature around the Golden Gate area, let's say the Presidio area of San Francisco. Let's say those two temperatures are about 30 degrees different. Well, 30 degrees equates to about 30 knots of wind flowing through the central San Francisco Bay. So in other words, on a typical summer day, Sacramento area, Central Valley could heat up to say 95 degrees. We might have a 65 degree temperature around the Golden Gate. So that 30 degree difference equates to about 30 knots of wind speed. Of course, it doesn't always work that way, but in general, for the San Francisco Bay boater, it's a good rule of thumb. Let's also talk about other effects of the summertime wind pattern on boating on San Francisco Bay. So we just talked about that funnel effect through the central San Francisco Bay. As the wind really kicks in, that sea breeze kicks in, it flows through the Golden Gate. It flows right towards Alcatraz and right towards the southeast tip of Angel Island called Point Blunt. It is literally focused on this stretch of water right here. This stretch of water, by local boaters, is called the slot for that reason. It is a slot of about a mile to a mile and a half wide of very concentrated sea breeze winds. So you might have another 5 knots or so, even 10 knots concentrated in this area called the slot. If you look at some of the leeward sides of these land masses, specifically Angel Island, the Tiburon Peninsula here, the city front extending south towards, say, South Beach Harbor and south, even the leeward side of Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island. These areas for the San Francisco Bay boater can be breaks in the action, so to speak. You might have a very brisk sail through the Central Bay, through the slot, with 25 to 30 plus knots of wind. And almost instantly, it drops behind Angel Island to almost zero. You can coast along and be in the sun and warmth very quickly. Talking about those microclimates of San Francisco Bay, they are very distinct in our summer and fall months. And one thing I wanted to mention quickly in relation to the wind patterns coming through the gate is what happens many times in the summer, not so much in the fall, more in the spring and summer. You'll see fog rolling in with that sea breeze that kicks in late morning around noon. So the fog literally is that moist marine layer that hangs out here in the coastal areas north and south of the Golden Gate. As that sea breeze kicks in, the fog is literally pulled in through the Golden Gate funnel and it ends up spreading out over the Central Bay area and spreading out a little bit on some extremely foggy days over into the North and East Bay areas of this Central Bay. But usually the fog tends to really thin out right around Treasure Island, east side of Angel Island, especially up in the Richmond area. It tends to thin out quickly and burn off, as the local sailors say, fairly quickly. So fog can be an effect that will also come in with that strong sea breeze in the summer months. Okay, so one of the things you hear quite often in sailing around the bay and talking to other sailors that are very familiar with sailing in San Francisco Bay is that if you can sail in San Francisco Bay, especially during the summer windy months of the year, you can sail almost anywhere with confidence. That's probably because of all the things going on in a fairly concentrated area in San Francisco Bay. You've got what we talked about, the summer sea breezes. You've got fog. You have a fairly small area for shipping. Large shipping container ships and tanker ships come right through the gate along with all that wind. and all that fog sometimes. So as a boater on San Francisco Bay, in your electronic package, you should have, if you can, radar. Radar is very effective at pointing out objects through limited visibility conditions such as fog. You should have a good depth sounder because many parts of the bay are quite shallow. You should have a good GPS chart plotter, which will indicate your position any time of the day or night accurately. In addition, it will also give you important information such as speed over ground and course over ground, which is invaluable to fight some of the currents that we will talk about on San Francisco Bay as well. So, talking about safety, in addition to all of the regular safety items that you should have aboard your vessel, as required by the U.S. Coast Guard and the state of California, you should also consider some of these important electronic devices as well. Okay, so one of the things that I'd like to talk about that's kind of thrown into the overall mix here of everything going on in San Francisco Bay are the currents. You might hear about the San Francisco Bay currents as being quite brisk at certain points of time, and they are. But if you learn how to plan your route across the bay or around the bay with the currents in mind, you can have a much more pleasant time on the water. For instance, since we know that during the summer and fall months, the predominant wind pattern of San Francisco Bay is going to be that thermal sea breeze, kicking in around late morning and lasting just before sunset. It's going to blow from the west to the east or through the gate. So if we have a current, which would be in this case an ebb current, which is flowing out the gate as the water level drops, as the tide drops, that ebb current will really start to kick in. And again, the Golden Gate forms a funnel there for those currents to sweep towards and accelerate. So if you think of the flow of water then in an ebb from east to west, that is against the wind pattern of the typical summer and fall, west to east. What happens when you have an opposing current to strong winds? The waves and the bay chop build up steep and quickly. It's not uncommon on a typical summer day with 25-30 knots of wind and a strong ebb to see 5, maybe even 6 foot waves in the Central Bay, especially near the Golden Gate. So please plan accordingly, looking at your tide charts and looking at your wind patterns for the season that you're going to be out there. Of course, most areas of the bay won't see these extreme effects of current against wind, but especially in the Central Bay and the Golden Gate area, that can be experienced on a daily basis, summer and fall. Okay, so we've talked about our summer and fall typical wind patterns on the bay. Let's talk about winter and spring. So winter and spring weather patterns can be vastly different than the summer and fall. Winter and spring weather patterns are typified by 2 different types of weather systems. You have high pressure weather system, and you have a low pressure, which could be called a low pressure cyclonic storm system. So in the northern hemisphere, our high pressure weather systems flow in a clockwise rotation. In the northern hemisphere, our low pressure cyclonic systems flow in an anti-clockwise. So if you look at the ocean areas offshore of California into the Gulf of Alaska, sometimes we have the high pressure weather systems which are circulating in a clockwise rotation. That high pressure system in the winter and spring moves. It can move north and south and east and west. When it is positioned just right, let's say off the northern California coast, maybe the southern Oregon coast, it directs storms over the top of us, and we end up with beautiful, sunny, sometimes warm days in the winter and the spring, sometimes for extended periods of time. The winds on the bay can be light and variable, and even from the north, and very nice sailing on some of those days when the high pressure is centralized just offshore, just off the Northern California coast, driving the storms over the top. Occasionally though, and sometimes quite frequently on some years, those storm systems that are born in the Gulf of Alaska, the cyclonic storm systems that have that counterclockwise flow to them, they will move and bump the high pressure areas out and move in. And when they do, we can expect strong southerly winds, south to southwesterly winds blowing sometimes for days in advance of a storm system because of that counterclockwise flow. So these strong southerly winds, again, will blow from the ocean through the Golden Gate, sometimes exceeding 40 to 50 knots before a storm blows through on central San Francisco Bay. Those are the systems to stay tied to the dock, stay in your harbor, because those storm systems can be quite dangerous. Again, considering the currents flowing around, and if you have that much wind against the current, you can have very rough conditions out there on the bay. As the storm system blows through, the winter and spring cyclonic storms blow through, the wind will shift quite rapidly from a southwest to a west to a northwest wind after the front passes through the region. Usually the fronts coming through the Gulf of Alaska across our area are from northwest to southeast. So as the storm front moves through and the air mass changes from that low pressure system, you will have a northwest and gradually a north dying breeze after that storm front blows through. And of course, with storm fronts, we have rain, sometimes heavy rain for days at a time, depending upon the speed of that storm front passage. So now we know we have our winter and spring storm systems, what to watch out for in the bay, and we know our summer and fall typical wind and weather patterns on San Francisco Bay. So at least we have a generalized idea of how to plan our activities on the water. Okay, so as you can see here with this slide, it's showing a high and a low pressure. So the high pressure area, as you can see, is well above the low pressure area that forms over land because of that unequal heating. So the low pressure area is formed when the air rises, the warmer air rises, and it is filled with the cooler sea breeze coming in, which is indicated here by this sort of blue arrows coming in and the hot air rising, or the red arrows rising. As you can see over to the right here in the slide, there's a low pressure area above the ocean, above the water. It's the air mass actually is falling towards the air on the ocean, and as it flows in towards the land, it's forming a high pressure and a low pressure area. That's exactly what is causing our thermal sea breezes. Okay, let's look at this slide here. This slide is similar, but it is showing how when the sea breeze kicks in, you might see off like number 3 here, as the sea breeze, that blue arrow flows towards land, it's actually accelerating here. And it's creating this circular effect, this flow rising from the land and dropping towards the ocean and then flowing back towards the land. It's accelerating. This whole system can accelerate because of that thermal engine that's set up over the inland areas. And if you look at the land area here, you'll see in the central part of this slide, you'll see how the wind flows towards the land. If you can imagine the Golden Gate Gap being right there at that central location as a funnel, as the wind will accelerate through the Golden Gate Gap and cause those very high winds during the summer and fall months that we see in central San Francisco Bay. So we've talked about the wind patterns. Let's talk about some of the effects that the water movement has on our sailing and boating on San Francisco Bay. So as you can see here with this slide, it is showing in different colors the different speeds of the water currents. This is sort of a typical slide that you'll see in an ebb current as the water flows from, say, San Pablo Bay to the north. It's flowing down past the Richmond area, out around Angel Island, towards the Golden Gate. Again, that funnel area. So as these currents flow towards the Golden Gate, if you can imagine that wind pattern that we just talked about, pushing against those currents, pushing against the water, that's when we have the steep chop and the rough conditions in the Central Bay. So when looking at water currents on the bay, here are some screenshots showing the effects, the actual modeled effects of San Francisco Bay currents, or the horizontal movement of the water out towards the Golden Gate. You can see how it's very focused coming around the islands out towards the Golden Gate. And again, if it's a strong westerly wind, those currents are going to affect greatly the sea state out on the bay. So let's talk about our final ideas today of how the San Francisco Bay boater can really enjoy their time on the water, not only by sailing and motoring around the bay in varying conditions and how to plan for those varying conditions, but also how to sometimes just relax and get out of the windy bay areas and into warm, sunny, calmer areas. Well, some of my favorite places on San Francisco Bay to do just that are as follows. Let's talk about some of the leeward sides, as we talked about earlier. The leeward side of these land masses: Tiburon Peninsula, Angel Island, Treasure Island, Yerba Buena Island, and even the Sausalito area in Richardson Bay. So if we think about these areas as being the leeward side of our typical strongest winds that can occur over the bay, winter or summer, are those west, southwest, and maybe northwest winds. So those would cause leeward shores here, meaning that the wind is going to be typically less here, and the waves will not build up here. So great places to anchor and go and get out of these strong winds. Or if you're caught out on the bay and you simply need to take a breath and before you get back to your home port, these might be great areas to do so. So one of my favorite places is Clipper Cove here in between Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island. It's a nice little cove. There are some shallow areas as you come into the cove. So consult your charts and your tide chart and the draft of your vessel before you plan on going to Clipper Cove, but it is very protected in there. Another place are the several beaches on the east shore, leeward side of Angel Island. Great little coves over here. Again, consult your charts and your depth sounder as you approach those areas. And another area that I really love is Paradise Cove. Paradise Cove here on the Tiburon Peninsula is great. Wonderful place to go and anchor for the day, for the night, or if you simply just want to get out of the wind and have lunch. Wonderful place. So those three areas in particular in the Central Bay are great. There are many more, but we'll talk about those at a future time. So thanks for joining me. I really appreciated the talk here about weather, wind, currents, and how to best enjoy this beautiful place, this gem that we have right here in Northern California, San Francisco Bay.